Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage co-founder, chairman, and CEO of Concordia, Matthew Swift.
Good morning. I think, if anything, from yesterday, and I didn't realize it was going to resonate quite as much as it did, the phrase radical inclusivity was absolutely the theme of yesterday and will certainly be the theme of today. I'm pretty sure yesterday's talks left plenty percolating in everyone's brains last night. Before we dive in for more, I'd like to make you all aware of a few things to pay attention to as we get ready and pilot some things for this year's summit. If you haven't already, please download the Concordia Summit app, because there you're going to find a short questionnaire. Your response will help us find you a cross-sector partner with complementary goals, needs, and assets. Everyone in attendance, from a C-suite executive to a field worker, is invited to participate. We're also proud to announce Concordia Spark, a new project designed to enhance engagement at the summit and within our community. Spark feedback allows us to improve the summits year after year, ensuring the experience that speakers have, topics that we're talking about, that we're engaging as much as possible. You can stop by before entering the strategic dialogue rooms or head to the members and partnership lounge or the Concordia booth to participate. And I promise it's very quick and easy. And I can't emphasize how important this is to us, because we need to learn from your experiences and your perspectives. If you stop at the booth, also don't forget to take a moment to learn more about our pathway to social impact, as that video highlighted. Our campaigns that support, scale, and amplify our partnership work, and especially with the focus on the 2030 global agenda. Have a cup of coffee as well. As we joked yesterday, there are a lot of Colombians here at this summit, and we're very, very proud of our connection to Colombia. And we've brought Coffee Tap to bring Colombian-produced coffee to the summit. For every cup that you consume, you're empowering small share farmers, female entrepreneurs, and environmental conservationists in Colombia. So please check it out. Last but not least, please also take a moment today to vote for the Audience Choice Award for the P3 Impact Award. This is also very important. It's a partnership we have with the State Department, US, as well as USAID, and we bestow an award on a leading public-private partnership. So your voting and participation in that is very important. On a personal note, I'm very excited about this next session. We have a wonderful partnership with the B Team, an organization that I personally have great respect for, and a special mark that it is a real honor to have Paul Polman from Unilever back on this stage here at Concordia. So with that, thank you so much for coming, and enjoy day 2.
Sorry, Matthew, but what a good introduction. So welcome, everybody. This resonates partnership to me because you have everybody here. You have business, you have civil society organisations, you even have those dreadful labour unions with the chief troublemaker here to moderate and keep you in line. And indeed, of course, you have government. So welcome to all of you. And we have a big virtual community out there, of course, and they'll be logging in via live stream and Twitter. So today, rebuilding the key institutions that make up our global society. That's a challenge, it's just a small one, but you know what? We're going to do it. So if we're going to do this, it's about trust. It's really about a critical time when we know from the research, the Elderman Trust Barometer tells us that in fact trust is in crisis around the world. I think you all know that. You know it in your businesses, in your communities. So when you combine trust with a lack of transparency, then in fact you have a major driver. And of course, corruption is partly at the heart of that. If you think that child mortality rates are 1/3 higher in countries with higher levels of corruption than those with low corruption, that says everything. If people are frightened for their own world, for their children, many people can't live on the wages. In fact, 84% of our global poll tells us that people say minimum wages are just too low to live on, and yet we're 3 times richer as a society. So what's going on? In the last 30 years, GDP's increased by 3 times. And I would say to you, though, companies themselves know this is a problem because 10% loss to the total cost of doing business globally is a big amount of money. And frankly, we could bargain with them for that, for wages, so that would be a good thing. But there are governments, there are companies, there are NGOs, they're stepping up to fight corruption. And indeed, we saw that in the first summit in 2016 when the UK government welcomed, I think, around 43 countries, 6 international organisations, and the anti-corruption summit in London was a hit. If you remember, you couldn't move for people. And indeed, there was a total of 648 commitments on 22 themes. So today we'll hear a little bit about how we've gone. But I wanted to say, particularly to the private sector, thank you, because they're stepping up to help launch Open Ownership, the world's first registry for company ownership transparency, and that's really critical. And of course, more corporations are publishing tax principles to let their customers know how they are contributing to the communities they operate in. This is absolute vital leadership. There is no country in the world that doesn't have a tax evasion problem, and it's weakening our democracies. And then, of course, there is the momentum to fight corruption, increase transparency that we're going to talk about today. But today has to be an honest conversation. Bob Collymore said yesterday, if you don't face a problem, you can't solve it, and he's absolutely right. So to get you started, do what Matthew said, vote, go to the app, go to the 3 bars at the top, press polls, and then look for the session and date. We need you to tell us what businesses can do to actually help this problem. We were really looking forward to having the President of Ghana open the session today, but unfortunately was called to the UN early. So Minister for Planning, the Minister for Planning is here somewhere, Professor George Gyan-Baffour, and he'll share the President's remarks on the Ghanaian government's inspiring efforts to stamp out. So be active, voice your views, get online. This is a conversation that's going to change the world. Thank you for being here. Professor George Gyan-Baffour.
Thank you so very much. Thank you so very much for inviting my president to be here. I think I have seen Dr. Ngozi around, a former Minister for Finance in Nigeria, a former Deputy MD of the World Bank, and currently board member of Gavi, and other distinguished ladies and gentlemen. My president could not be here. He's, as we've been told, at the UN General Assembly as I speak. So what you hear from me here is his voice and what he really intended to say. And that is what I'm going to deliver this morning. Madam Moderator, I'm pleased to be here this morning, and I thank the organizers of this event for the opportunity to contribute to this all-important conversation. An audience such as this, comprising political, business, and civil society leaders, must surely be the appropriate venue for such an important conversation. In so saying, ladies and gentlemen, my comments on the subject matter will be based on my country and the measures we have put in place to fight the canker of corruption. We are doing this in order to drive investment, both domestic and foreign, into Ghana, as well as create the most business-friendly economy in Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, since Ghana's independence in 1957, that is about 60 years ago, corruption has been a perennial problem for successive governments. And in trying to address the problem, various governments have introduced a host of policies and measures, including some unconventional and draconian ones. We have promulgated anti-corruption decrees under the military regimes with provisions for lengthy jail terms. We have confiscated personal assets of public officials believed to have been corruptly acquired. We have declared zero tolerance against corruption. We've appealed to the good sense of the Ghanaian people through moral crusades for integrity and giving sermons on the sins of corruption. We have passed anti-corruption laws, we have strengthened anti-corruption institutions, and undertaken public sector, financial management, and institutional reforms. We have also ratified regional and international anti-corruption conventions as an expression of our commitment to the global fight against the menace of corruption. And we have even tied people to the stake merely on suspicion of their being corrupt and shot them dead. But ladies and gentlemen, corruption, however, continues to be a debilitating factor in the management of our public finances. It is worth bearing in mind that it is not only the headline corruption, the type that involves politicians, that retards our progress and hinders our development. The driver who knowingly puts a faulty vehicle on the road with the intention of paying bribes to the traffic policeman, the policeman who takes a bribe to allow an unlicensed driver on the roads, the planning official who allows a house to be constructed on the waterway, the customs officials that accepts a bribe and allows goods in without the payment of duties, the officials that allow drugs to be imported into and exported out of our country, and all the everyday petty bribe-taking that we all put up with. All such actions constitute corruption and retard our progress, even if they do not attract headlines. Unless we tackle this problem, we will run a real risk of cynicism, overcoming our politics, and thus of a catastrophic loss of confidence in our democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, corruption has to be defeated. It reduces revenue to the state, it holds back our economic growth, it leads to the flight of capital out of the country, and it inflates the cost of running government. It results in a loss of legitimacy and respect for legally constituted authority. Corruption demoralizes honest people and fills them with uncertainty, mistrust, and fear. It stifles initiative and creativity and dampens motivation. It undermines the merit system of rewards, appointments, and success, and it encourages mediocrity, laziness, and incompetence. Governments all over the world are plagued with corruption, except that under some governments, the disease becomes a raging epidemic. Corruption on any scale is expensive and has been especially expensive to Ghana's development. My party and I won last year's election because the Ghanaian people were dissatisfied about the direction in which the country, and indeed the economy, were heading. They were dissatisfied about the lack of jobs, rising cost of living, and in particular about the widespread and rampant nature of corruption under my predecessor. They voted for me because they believed my party and I were different and would do things differently. We cannot move forward without tackling the issue of extensive corruption, which continues to challenge our efforts at growth. This requires a sincere and effective policy of both identifying and punishing acts of corruption, and more importantly, putting in place mechanisms that discourage public and private actors from engaging in such acts. It is my belief that the fight against corruption must begin with a personal example. So on my part, I declared my assets 2 weeks after taking office, and my ministers and deputy ministers of state have also done the same. The declaration of assets is a constitutional obligation imposed on the president, the vice president, ministers, deputy ministers, and holders of senior level positions in the judiciary, also in parliament and in the executive. I have also directed the Criminal Investigation Department of the Ghana Police Service to investigate every single allegation of corruption of financial malfeasance leveled against any ministers or any of my appointees. We have furthermore ushered in a new regime of accountability. We are in the process of setting up, by Act of Parliament, an Office of Special Prosecutor, which will be independent of the executive to investigate and prosecute offenses of corruption of public and private delinquents, both past and present, and in a depoliticized manner. In addition, we've established a value for money unit within the Public Procurement Authority, and this unit will review all contracts to ensure that value for money information is provided on time. We already have made strides in the implementation of e-procurement to bring greater transparency and efficiency to our tendering process. This removes manual entry and reduces the risk of corruption in our procurement system. My government intends also to pass the Right to Information Bill into law very soon. We know that transparency protects officials and the public in dealing with the public purse. The public have the right to know what politicians and public officials do in their name. In ensuring greater transparency in who owns and controls companies, Ghana has made a series of commitments to prevent the misuse of companies and legal arrangements to hide the proceeds of crime and corruption. We are pleased to see Ghana emerge as one of the 3 champions on this issue identified by Transparency International in their review of the London Summit commitments that they are launching today. Our new companies bill will require every company in Ghana to provide information on who owns or who controls them. Companies who fail to provide this information will face sanctions. Importantly, the bill will require the establishment of a central register of beneficial ownership available to the public. This will make doing business in Ghana more transparent and reliable, and support local and foreign investment. Investment and companies want to know who they are doing business with and to be able to easily assess prospective partners and investors. Ladies and gentlemen, we are also very pleased to be working with the Open Ownership Consortium, which includes our hosts, the Team B and Transparency International, as well as with the UK's Department for International Development, DFID, to make sure that Ghana's registrar is in accordance with international best practice, that is, providing accessible open data that can be connected with data from other countries to identify ownership across borders. We are excited to be one of the first pilot countries, along with Ukraine, whose Justice Minister, Minister Petrenko, is here with us today. I recognize that the challenges in our quest to root out corruption remain. Nonetheless, I commit to you, as I commit each day, to remain true to our mandate as a government, to build integrity, restore trust, and deliver for my people. It will take all of us, including those in this room, who recognize how dangerous the erosion of trust is for our economies and democracies, to redouble our efforts to lead with integrity and to work together to create the sustainable development that people and the planet deserves. Thank you for this invitation, and I look forward to seeing you in Ghana to continue this exciting conversation. I thank you so very much for your attention.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you indeed. And we've already note today that Ghana is a proud member of the Open Government Partnership. So please send our message of support to your President.
I will. Thank you.
And now let me introduce a man who needs no introduction. Polman, Officially, he's the CEO of Unilever. I never know how he has time to do that job. But he's a global citizen that we all admire for the courage and the values to lead. I can tell you, you know, that Paul cares deeply about people, about rights, and about integrity. Paul Polman.
Okay, thanks Sharon, and thanks for the opportunity. And to Minister Gyan-Baffour, thanks for your introduction in Ghana. It's encouraging to see the intent of the progress and the plans you're putting in place. And obviously, as we all know, reputation is made by what we do, not by what we say. But this is clear that we have to work together and give countries like that an opportunity to progress. And what I'll be talking about is a little bit the role of the private sector there as well. It's easy for us to sit there and say, you should do this and you should do that, but at the end of the day, we're all in this together. In fact, if you look at Concordia, and its meaning, it actually says, the Latin word, it might not only say harmony, but the literal translation is with our hearts, from our hearts, which actually goes to the essence of the Sustainable Development Goals. As we all know here, and I proudly wear the pin, it's about irreversibly eradicating poverty and doing that in a more sustainable and equitable way. It's a program of leaving no one behind, and goal 16, which is governance, rule of law, and what we're really talking here today, is actually one of these principal fundamentals to do that. I'm very happy to see that President Akufo-Addo, who couldn't be with us today, he actually, before he became president, was actually an active human rights lawyer, so he should know this better than anybody else. And I'm also happy to see that Minister Baffour himself is the president of the Poverty Reduction Committee. And again, what we're talking here about is probably at the roots of alleviating poverty. Now, trust, and as Sharon was saying before, transparency is an absolute fundamental ingredient for prosperity. Without transparency, you don't have trust, and without trust, you don't build that prosperity. I'm actually very happy with, despite a lot of the challenges that the internet gives us and the issues that we have to deal with, like any new technology, it does bring us transparency. Every day, I just take the Financial Times of the day with me and take you through headline after headline of people or companies that have been caught with their pens down because they simply didn't behave. And increasingly, that is visible all across the world. In fact, trust is the very foundation of our society, of any society, and cuts through everything we do, from trust in our neighbors, if you want to, trust in our products that we sell, trust in economic institutions that we talk today, trust in the governments that represent you. The general public's trust in many institutions, unfortunately, is in decline. Again, Sharon already referred to this crisis of trust that we are in. It's actually at an all-time low. And on top of that, it's going in the wrong direction. We're all familiar with the Edelman Trust Barometer that gets issued at the times of Davos. And actually what you see for the first time is that the people, what they call are in the distruster camp, actually outnumber the others. That's not a good situation to be in. And frankly, nobody is excluded. You have governments there, then not surprisingly the media, they're earning very quickly a place of distrust beyond what we've ever seen before. But the same is true for businesses, NGOs, and CEOs obviously are equally on that list. So this lack of trust is the basic reason why people lose faith in us, why people lose faith in experts, why people lose faith in the people that they have elected and that are supposedly representing them. It is obviously closely linked to the fallout that we're seeing in the global economic crisis. It's closely linked to the vacuum that we have, enormous vacuum, I would say, in political leadership. And it's partly driven by the corrosive effects of this pervasive corruption that we're talking about today that is linked to goal number 16. Now, we see multiple expressions of impatience by the citizens of this world, and it's all across the world, and a fascinating mix of responses as well, be it on social media, to really denounce this state of affairs. And it's especially the young, actually, not surprisingly, that are increasingly speaking up. Now, a world where trust is low is challenging, both for business as well as for governments. As I mentioned, reputation is earned by trust. Brands are built on trust. And it's the foundation for companies like mine, for the relationships we have with our customers and ultimate consumers. Just let's take a little example. If you take the market cap of Unilever, that's about $175 billion. If you look at our asset value, it's about $25 billion. The difference, the $150 billion, some people call it goodwill, some people call it intangibles, but frankly, these are accounting terms. Ultimately, that difference is the trust. It's the trust that the people put into our brands to deliver this intangible value that they're looking for. It's also the basis for business longevity. Leading for the long term and building a successful company for the hundreds of years that we think about, not just the next quarter, requires obviously to build this trust. It's a sad thing to see here in the US that when I was born, the average length of a publicly traded company was about 67 years. That has dropped now to 17 years. Companies that myopically are focused on just simply satisfying the shareholder needs and optimizing the returns or the value of a few individuals don't have a long life. Because if these companies are operated without this real purpose, why should society expect them to be around? So you have to move your business models from value creation solely to value and values creation if you want to have a longevity. Now the SDGs offer us a framework to do that. We're actually being given this wonderful 17 goals, this roadmap for the world, which I would call the only moral framework that we now have on how we should all operate. That was signed here 2 years ago by 193 countries in September in the UN. Now we've made some progress in many of these areas, but unfortunately, if you want to be really tough on yourself, we're 2 years in now and progress is far too slow. Everybody knows what needs to be done. There are very few CEOs who will tell you that they want more unemployment, more air pollution, and more people going to bed hungry. They just don't exist. Yet, the direction is therefore clear, but yet we're incapable to doing it at speed and scale. And this is where we need to raise our level of ambition especially. Governments clearly cannot do it alone. We need the private sector actively involved for many reasons that you well know, not only the innovations and technologies, but also the resources and funding. And progressive partnership here is at the roots of it between business, government, and civil society. If we don't start to behave differently and put these partnerships right square in the middle, these partnerships for the common good, not for our own interest, these partnerships that have the respect and dignity of the individuals as a first prime objective, the interest of their communities, and partnerships that think intergenerational. The main ingredients, dignity, respect, communities, intergenerational, that is at that basis for making the Sustainable Development Goals come alive. And obviously, not surprisingly, an enormous opportunity comes out of that for business. With the Business and Sustainable Development Commission that we had created to see how we could rally the business community behind the SDGs, which ultimately is complex, the 17 goals and 169 targets, we actually unlock an opportunity that is well over $12 trillion that we can add to the global economy as a minimum. And what I'm so excited about, if you look at all of these goals with the Sustainable Development Goals, all 17 goals, you actually find that we're at a point, perhaps sadly enough, where the cost of not acting is actually starting to be higher than the cost of acting. That makes it so appealing, even for the ones that don't have a moral compass. You take the cost that we are currently incurring just on conflict prevention and wars is 9% of GDP. The cost of climate change that we're already incurring now is 5% of GDP. In many countries in the world, the cost of stunting or access to food security, 10, 12% of GDP, whilst implementing the Sustainable Development Goals only costs you 3 to 4% of GDP. The cost of inacting is already higher than the cost of acting. But it needs to take, it needs to have a purpose-driven, socially accountable business model that becomes mainstream instead of being currently, in too many cases, at the margin. So the current operating models for companies, I would argue, need to change. We cannot achieve these goals and these objectives with business as usual. We need to move just mere government to governance and transparency. We need to move from pure profit for profit to profit and purpose, what I call the value and values. And to deliver this systemic change, we need to also change some of our incentive systems. I personally don't believe that people are badly intended. In fact, I believe in the goodness of everybody and the potential of everybody to contribute to these sustainable development goals. But why are we not behaving then the way we should be behaving? And it often boils down to the incentive systems that are around us that drive our behaviors. So we need to change some of these incentive systems, moving the markets to the long term, providing legal obligations for companies or company directors to account for the environmental and social impacts of business. And then last but not least, equally importantly, to operate in full transparency on ownership and taxation. The B team and others have written about this new social contract that is worth reading, actually. All of this will only be possible if governments work with business to create the right frameworks for system-wide change. Business needs good governance to help the framework for tax and regulation that can deliver these sustainable developments, to develop the infrastructure, to fight corruption, public and private, to invest in the science and technology, to deliver the innovative breakthroughs, to break down the silos, to engage stakeholders and build coalitions and partnerships, and to be open to the robust debates that we need with the citizens' participation in terms of the validity of our business models. So this is where transparency comes in, where government budget spending, contracting are concerned, and where the B team has actually been focused on and moved the needle, hopefully a little bit in the right direction. Now, business has its role as well to play by demonstrating better its commitment to what I would call sustainable capitalism and helping actually increasingly de-risk this political process. It's simply not easy to be a politician. And I think we should have a core responsibility, as we see happening in many of these areas, to de-risk this political process. It also requires us to actually fight for transparency. It requires us to pay tax where we should be paying tax. It requires us to publish the data that we need to be publishing, just like it requires us to treat people fairly in our total value chain. I always say that by outsourcing many of our responsibilities that we do as a business community, we certainly cannot outsource our responsibilities that go with that. So what we have seen where these partnerships start to work between governments and business community or the private sector, we really are moving the needle. I would say the best example of that would be the Paris Agreement, where we had an enormous groundswell of businesses, including the financial sector, actively pushing governments to be a little bit more courageous in Paris. When the US made the unfortunate decision to go out of the Paris Agreement, at least the intent, if I may say, because nothing has happened yet, you saw this enormous groundswell again, the We Are Still In movement and many other things, where cities, states and private sectors actually stepped up. And we have some good examples of alliances for the common interest where we are having breakthroughs. The alliance that Ngozi is leading with the Gavi Alliance on immunization for the world's poorest countries, the Tropical Forest Alliance that we have to get out of the devastating effects of deforestation, and the Open Government Partnership that has been mentioned, where over 70 governments working with civil society and now increasingly, fortunately, the private sector help to make governments more transparent and accountable to citizens, to ultimately improve the quality of governance and of the services that citizens receive, and obviously business then ultimately benefits from as well. The good thing is that momentum is building with business to tackle these sources of challenge. Business increasingly has the confidence to speak up against corruption, transparency, tax evasion, and we're seeing that with the WEF partnership, which is called PACI, which stands for Partnership Against Corruption Initiative, which involves CEOs, at least 100 CEOs of the leading companies across the world. The UN Global Compact, with over 5,000 members who are embedding these 10 principles, which are firmly based on this integrity that we're talking about. The B20 Anti-Corruption Task Force, which has actively been feeding this in the G20, which now has it firmly on the agenda. And then the open ownership created by the consortium of leading transparency organizations with the support of the private sector to obviously make make data publicly available if you want to. 1.9 million companies are now participating in that in 24 countries. And I would be remiss not to recognize the B team although I'm a member myself and might be a little bit biased, but the B team actually has created the new working group on responsible taxation. And then we have one of our members, together with Ngozi, we have Mo Ibrahim, that you know very well for the better governance in Africa. B team, very active in this respect. And then I'd like to recognize Robert Barrington, obviously, who has been crucial in the London Anti-Corruption Summit last year, and we'll hear about that in a minute. But I think that one thing is clear, despite progress on the summit and all these initiatives that I've been talking about, we still need far more momentum to drive the agreed actions forward. This certainly is not a time for complacency. The Edelman indicators are a sober reminder, in my opinion, on what the state of being is to date, and that's frankly not good enough. We should give ourselves there a C- at best. We need to be standing together here, and we need to be loud and clear. No compromise. Like the public, we must voice our values and speak up about those. We do certainly have to operate with a higher sense of humility. We need to learn from our mistakes. So should we also listen to what is being told. What is being told about what isn't working, what is working, and work with others to fix it. Collaboration is absolutely key. And we need to keep in mind that we're focusing here on the greater good. We must put our egos aside and advocate a truly zero-tolerance approach. Demonstrate that this approach is entirely in line with growth and innovation. In fact, I would argue it's the only way to get growth and innovation. So here you have it. Rebuilding trust and integrity is critical for the future of our society. We need together to create the enabling conditions to break out of the current model and drive real solutions to the real challenges we face. With the SDGs, we already have a roadmap for shared purpose, and now we need to work more closely than ever together to implement it. And what better way, in my opinion, to restore people's trust and faith than simply doing it with purpose. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Just brilliant. So you heard it, with our hearts, from our hearts. Voice our values with no compromise and focus on the greater good. Paul believes, we all believe, that a zero poverty, zero carbon world is possible, and he has taken sustainability to the heart of the boardroom and of course challenges everybody else to do the same thing. Thank you, Paul, for all that you do. Well, I want to remind you to vote. Vote on the app because your advice is important. It isn't just an activity, it's actually advice for us to take into the next steps. And somebody who's actually watching, demanding, developing the evidence is Robert Barrington, Executive Director of Transparency International from the UK. Robert's presentation is about progress. And of course, he took the UK commitments from the summit in London, and this promises to practices will actually tell us how well we're doing. Insights into government and their progress, or not, on anti-corruption. Welcome, Robert, and thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's 500 days ago since the London Anti-Corruption Summit, and we've today published a little progress report as to how well governments have been doing on the commitments they made. You'll see also on the slides we've got a pledge tracker website where you can have a look at how well countries are doing. Of the 43 countries that gathered in London 500 days ago, they made an amazing 648 anti-corruption commitments between them. And that sounded fantastic at the time, but of course we were thinking then, what will it look like in 500 days' time? And I remember very particularly our global chair, José Ugaz, who's about to be on the panel, was interviewed on the news that night, and he said, he was asked, how many marks out of 10 do you give this summit? And he said, oh, I give it 8 out of 10 today, and the test will be next year. So here we are next year. How well are we doing? Well, I'll come on to that in a moment. I'll tell you some of the statistics. But what we can also see is some of the trends that are happening in where things have been successful in those 500 days. And I want to talk particularly about this issue of collaboration. Now, I've been thinking about talking on this stage about collaboration for a couple of months. So it was with a certain amount of shock that I saw the program of events around UNGAR, where I see every other session around UNGAR is also about collaboration. So I feel my thunder has been a bit stolen. However, it's clearly one of the critical things that is facing us in the modern world, not just on the other SDGs, but also on this very particular one of corruption. And we see that one of the things that the Anti-Corruption Summit was good at in London was highlighting that when individual countries or companies or civil society organizations try to tackle this issue by themselves, they're going to be far less successful. There was a huge push on collaboration. And it was around governments working with governments on things like intelligence sharing. It was around companies working with governments on things like open ownership. And it was about civil society as a generator of ideas and as a holder to account of governments. We've particularly seen in Ukraine, for example, the ProZorro platform, an open contracting platform showing how you can get civil society, governments, and companies to work together. Amazingly, that on this healthcare platform, around 2,000 healthcare organizations in Ukraine, on average, reduced their procurement spend by 15%, really simply through going through clean procurement processes. This was a huge step forward. So how are we doing on those 648 commitments? Well, we tracked about half of them through our national chapters. And we've rated them as to whether, in the first place, they were ambitious or not ambitious. We also had a look at whether they were new. Those of you who are familiar with the world of government commitments will recognize the fact that sometimes the same thing is announced time and time again. So we were wary of that in the summit. Well, the good news was that of the commitments we tracked, which is about half of them, about a third of those we thought were ambitious, and about a half of those were new and ambitious. So already there was a sort of a leading set out there. But what we also saw was that at the bottom end, there were about 59, which were neither new nor ambitious. So that set the scale the other end. Of those countries who have made commitments, we're pretty encouraged. About 2/3, we think, of the commitments are showing good signs of progress. Some are completed, some have yet to be completed. And there are some countries which stand out, perhaps some surprises. Spain, Indonesia, doing particularly well on their commitments. Others doing less well. We find that the United States, Japan, and Switzerland are doing, yes, less well. Afghanistan also, but Afghanistan a slight exception because they were so ambitious in their commitments. It would have been very hard under any circumstances to stick to them. But Switzerland, Japan, United States, it's a shame to see those countries, I think, amongst the laggards. Just to be clear, these are leaders and laggards in terms of who made commitments at the summit, not in terms of their overall anti-corruption performance. But this is a bit of an indicator. Finally, I just want to flag one thing that really came out of the summit and I think speaks to us as an audience today. The countries that have done best were those who were the most ambitious. They took risks. The UK was one of those in terms of agreeing to host the summit in the first place. But other countries, like Spain and Indonesia, really stuck their necks out. And I think it's a sign that in this area, as in so many others, if you just sort of stick with mediocre commitments, which are more or less what you would have been forced to do anyway, we're not going to make the progress we need to. If you're ambitious, if you're willing to take risks, we can really make much bigger progress. And I just want to finish by saying a couple of things. The first, very parochially, to talk about the UK. Of course, we've been watching the UK very closely. We've had 2 changes of governments in the UK since that summit. We're interested to know whether the UK will continue to take an international lead. It's very unclear at the moment, but somebody needs to take an international lead on this issue, otherwise there will simply be a vacuum. Secondly, I wanted to say that we're hugely impressed with the B team and the B team's leadership on this issue of corruption, and we enjoy working with them. I hope you as businesses do as well. But I look across organizations like the B team and others with a certain amount of envy about what's been achieved and accomplished in the space around climate change. And if I would have one wish for what the panel might come up with in a few minutes' time, it's that we might plot a course where this issue of corruption can be dealt with in the spirit of collaboration and partnership between civil society and business in the way that climate change has. So the London Anti-Corruption Summit, it was a fantastic step forward, 648 commitments. 2/3 of those, we think something is happening. But the next step, I think, is to move corruption up there with the issue of climate change as to something that we all need to care about and to act on in a uniform and unified way. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you very much. Whoopsie.
We've destroyed the technology. So, let me say thank you, Robert. You've heard it, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But if 2/3 of countries are making progress, that's a good start. Now let's hear more about progress from an amazing panel. Minister Petrenko from the Ukraine, welcome. Ngozi, chair of Gavi, but you know, she's so much more, a friend, a sister, fellow leader of the B team. She's an amazing global leader. And indeed, José Ugaz, who's the chair of Transparency International, again, an NGO that we all value. Mariam, inspiring economist from the African Development Bank, welcome. And indeed, Geoff Healy, the chief economist, where are you, Geoff? The Chief External Affairs Officer. What a title, Geoff. I want to know what you get up to at night. But he's from my own country, of course, from BHP, the company that I grew up knowing as the big Australian. So I'm really happy to be standing here with a fellow Aussie. Now, we want to hear more from this group about progress because they know, they live it, they watch it, they observe what's going on. And the first round of questions is just going to be really quick, and I'm going to ask them to rate out of 10, in fact, how they think we're doing, with maybe one sentence if they want to expand. So, Minister Petrenko, governments, you heard it. Out of 10, how are governments dealing? How are governments dealing with the question of corruption? Out of 10, give me a figure first. I'm a former teacher, you know, I'm very tough.
In any effective team, the team of different people, different professionals, but they have to have one real goal, and they have to believe in it. It's an example of our country, because we had a lot of problems during these 4 years. It was a revolution, it was a war with Russia, but we believe and we change our country. So, if you believe and if you change, you are successful.
So, 5, 6, 4, 3, 7 out of 10, come on. Government.
7, I think 7.
7 out of 10.
Yeah, we are in the middle, but we are looking forward.
There's a big call. Governments are doing 7 out of 10. I think it's probably a bit high, but let's see. He's got to defend his own government, of course. We understand this. Okay, Ngozi, what do you think? How are institutions doing?
Well, I'll just say very quickly that we've seen there's a low level of trust in governments. And when people don't trust governments, they also tend not to trust international institutions. That's what the research shows. So with that low level, I would say maybe 4 out of 10.
4 out of 10. I think she's probably right. Do we think she's right? Yes, okay. I have to say that. She's always on the money, Ngozi. Okay, let's indeed go to José Ugaz, who's the chair of Transparency International. This is a great organisation, as I said.
I would say 6. Civil society is a game changer in the anti-corruption struggle right now. You have seen millions of people in Brazil, thousands in Guatemala, Honduras, Dominican Republic, millions of people in South Korea, Romania, South Africa. So I think this is a mobilization of the people that now is getting up, that challenge is sustainability, so I think that's what the other 4 points we need to achieve in the near future.
Okay, so what was the number?
6.
6 out of 10. 4, 6, 7. I'm going to have some mathematical genius to do the average here. Okay, Mariam, you know, you're the economist from the African Development Bank. What do you think in terms of broader institutions?
I would say regional institutions, I would rank them as 6, particularly from Africa, because I think increasingly the African Union, the Economic Commission for Africa, and the African Development Bank are joining the discourse on on really tackling corruption on the global scale. So I would rate them a 6. There's a lot to be done, but they're making some progress.
Okay, 6. Geoff, what do you think? Where is business, and how far do we have to go?
So Sharon, I'd say business is sort of around 5 to 6. So I think a lot of focus on the burden of transparency as opposed to the benefits. The expectation should be that business across the board, large SMEs, SOEs should contribute. And I think that when you look at the quality of the information, too much of it's too hard to work with.
Okay, I think that's a very honest assessment. So we're between 5 and 6. Don't sort of quote me on the accuracy of those measures, but it shows that in fact we've got a way to go. I recall when the Business and Human Rights community launched the index for 100 companies against human rights. It was in fact quite shocking, but because only about the biggest companies are only doing about 30% of the job to actually respect human rights. So I think Geoff's right, we've got a long way to go. Thank you all for that. And now I'm going to actually ask you a few harder questions. So, Geoff, you speak for the largest mining company in the world. Well, I'm not sure now that
That's
you're
right.
BHP
Absolutely.
and not Billiton, but
Absolutely,
he's still going to claim
the big
it.
issue.
So. And what happens? What are the dynamics when a company tries to create trust and to lead from the front?
Well, I mean, I think it is right to say at the start that we at BHP have had a huge commitment to transparency now going back a long way. So, back in 2000, we produced information around the taxes we paid and the royalties we paid in our operations. But 3 years ago, we really stepped up the transparency and now report. In fact, we have our next report coming out tomorrow. We now report country by country, project by project. So we do enable the communities that we work with to really have a hard look at where the money is going, whether that's local, regional, or at country level. And you might say, Sharon, why do we do that? I think Paul laid it out well before. For a business like ours, it's absolutely fundamental that we have public acceptance and trust in our business. So, we quite simply have to do that. And I think, as was laid out well before, you can't get to trust without transparency. And if I could just give a very quick example in our industry, because we're not consumer-facing like Unilever is, but don't misunderstand how important it is to work with our communities. About 3 or 4 weeks ago, we committed to investing another $2.5 billion in a mine in northern Chile. And that mine's going to extend the mine life of that particular mine by 50 years. And we're building desal plants, we're building power stations, all sorts of water pipelines. You have to work with your communities. They have to be hand in glove with you. And if you're not transparent, you can't have any hope of having trust.
Well, 2 things are really important. You've made a commitment as a company to beneficial ownership and transparency, and I think we all agree with you, transparency is at the core. I know for us, certainly, it's the same thing in terms of supply chains. If you don't know who you're actually contracting to, then when the workforce is a hidden workforce of up to 94% for some of the biggest companies, then we can't start to tackle the problems. So absolutely give him a big hand for a company that's saying beneficial ownership and transparency, that's the answer. Come on. It's got to be livelier than that, You've all had coffee now. Now, Mariam, you've seen business done across the continent, and I know it's a tough thing, but can you give me an example of good practice and an example of bad practice?
That's a tough question. In terms of good practice, I think really seeing, the whistleblowing element of tracking and combating illicit financial flows on the continent, I think has been very critical. It's involved, business stakeholders coming up and saying, wait a minute, things are not going right, we need to do something about it, as well as government responding to that. And it's sort of created incentives that's forcing all actors to do something to challenge the status quo. Now, in terms of bad practice, I think, business as usual. Unfortunately, Africa has this unfortunate and perhaps incorrect perception that corruption is very African, but I would beg to disagree. It's not. Corruption it's human, you know. It's challenging trust. It's really using vested interests for your own purpose. So in terms of bad examples, I think we have more than enough bad examples around, you know. And what we have realized is a lot of it is coming from the commercial sector. Illicit financial flows range from a various spectrum of things, including commercial sector, you know, criminal activities and corrupt activities. And it's interesting to see that in Africa, 60% of illicit financial flows comes from the commercial sector. So private sector really needs to come to board in order to address this.
Look, I couldn't agree with Mariam more. You know, if you think that a fundamental social protection floor, which would give everybody confidence that they could survive, would cost less than 6% of GDP in most of the developing economies, and you look at the flows of the illicit financial flows and think about what you could add to the tax base of those countries, and then we could demand that they invest that money in their people, would strengthen democracy, would give people back some hope, take away some of the fear and rebuild trust. So, Mariam, absolutely, we have to do something about the level of shared prosperity where people know that if we don't share it, then frankly, more of the same is going to destroy our democracies. So thank you for those words of wisdom. Now, Ngozi, I'm just going to embarrass Ngozi a little, because when she was the finance minister in that country that I've come to love, of Nigeria, then she actually experienced what it was like when she decided she was going to champion the whole issue of anti-corruption and transparency. So, Ngozi, give us a couple of minutes on a personal reflection about how tough is it to actually do this job?
It could take the whole day.
I know, I know. And we've shared a drink or three on this, I can tell you.
But I'll just take one example. I think one good example of trying to introduce transparency is when we began in 2004 to publish the revenue streams of all levels of government. Previous to that, in the country, nobody really knew how much state governments, how much the federal government, got monthly in terms of revenue. And so it was easy for, let's say, people to go to their state governors and say, we couldn't do X because we didn't get enough money this month. So by monthly publishing this in the newspaper, there was so much distress and distrust of the federal government, because the federal government at that time was being blamed. When teachers didn't get paid, when roads were not built, when there was no chalk in the classrooms, people simply said the federal government did not release the money this month. So by publishing what was released to each level of government in the newspapers, it was a revolution. And people had information in their hands. And I often say to people, I've used this example many times, the demand for this was so popular, we compiled it, I wish I'd brought it, in booklets that became the most boring bestsellers ever, because we couldn't keep enough of these. But there was a backlash, because it opened up information, because it opened up transparency. The people who were publishing this with my team were not exactly popular, and have never been.
It's true, and in fact, I challenged a couple of my friends from the Labour movement who are in government now when I was there last, because there is still a corrupt practice of kind of ghost salaries in the public sector. Ngozi tried to eradicate all of that, but we're still seeing a problem where people think that they can continue with these practices. Politicians, are not on the popularity table really around the world, but when you've got politicians like Minister Petrenko and indeed Ngozi, we need to champion them, because even though she's now a former politician, there are people
I don't
like
know
her.
if I'm even a politician. I'm an unlikely one.
Like her standing up, and we value them. So Minister Petrenko, you're in that camp. How tough is it? Your country's been through an incredible disaster. Conflict, devastation. I know I get daily emails from our workers that are really struggling. So how tough is it to take on this agenda in the midst of everything else?
You know, our country has chance to be changed. And during these 4 years, there were a lot of challenges, you know, in different spheres. We didn't have army, we didn't have public institutes, because there were no trust from civil society to those public institutes which were made by previous President Yanukovych. That's why people went to the revolution of dignity, and we won. So new government had to make something very special, which didn't have any examples in other countries. And we tried to do, and we started to do it. And today, when you see some examples like public procurement ProZorro, it's one of the best in the world. We are the first country who made the beneficiary owners register. We are a really first country. And we are really first country who integrated this beneficiary register of our country to the global beneficiary register. And we made a lot of things which gives people signal that they have to trust institutions. We have one of the biggest electronic system of declaration assets of public officials. 1 million public officials have to send their declarations in online, and any citizen can see what buildings, what money they have, how they live. So these examples give us understanding that our country is changing and we are becoming stronger every day. And there is very good triangle. It's business, civil society, and state. When this triangle is working all together, we can be successful in any position. Nevertheless, there is war and some problems in the economy. So, we'll do it.
That's an example of courage. Any of you who've been to the Ukraine or have read about the devastation that's actually still really permeating, their real challenges to build democracy, let alone to actually take on these issues, although we would say they go hand in hand. So there you have it, beneficial ownership from a government, beneficial ownership from a company. That's the partnership we're looking for. And then I'd like to go back to José, because you represent some of the best of us in civil society, and indeed you've got a track record of working with the private sector, but you also call out their failings, and I know that you've been an ally for us on many occasions. So what do you think business can do to most contribute to this problem? What's the thing that you would say to them all? You must do this. You must take on this if you're serious about eliminating corruption.
Fighting corruption is not an easy task, and I think we need to have a sincere approach. Have you asked why SDG number 16 has such a romantic name? It says peace, justice, and strong institutions. Compared to others, it says zero poverty, no hunger. Why don't we have a 16 SDG that says zero corruption, no corruption? Because politicians and governments don't like the word. So civil society is struggling when you see millions of people mobilizing around the world. And Brazil, I think, is a good example. The car wash case, the Lava Jato case, has had impact in 14 countries of the world, 2 countries of Africa, 12 countries of Latin America. And one of the main drivers was the profit of corrupt companies, the largest companies of Brazil, Odebrecht, Camargo Correa, Andrade Gutierrez, and others. What is the consequence of that? Because they wanted to obtain an easy profit, now companies that have been there for decades doing business are on the risk of going broken, and their reputation has been killed. It took decades for them to build a reputation, and now they are in such a difficult situation. So I think that the business sector, and that's something we're trying to work with the companies on the open ownership and other initiatives, need to understand that corruption does not pay, that it's better to do clean business and go to the market in equal conditions instead of obtaining illegal gains that at the end would generate situations like the one we are seeing in Brazil right now.
Yes, so indeed, we would simply underscore exactly what you've just said. And I think if you take the issue a little more broadly, then one issue the B team is actually starting to pay more attention to is increasing repression in many countries that leads to shrinking civil space. I don't think any of the panellists would disagree that, in fact, if you shrink the space for democratic institutions in civil society, then you actually really undermine our democracy. So I know it's tough, but, you know, again, to say to you, is this really important? Do all of you agree that we need to all stand up in the context of that shrinking democratic space and say to governments now, this is not acceptable? Is there anyone who disagrees with that proposition? No? Is there anyone out there who disagrees with that proposition? No? Okay, let's vote for civil society and transparency, but the fundamental rights of freedom of expression and freedom of association. This is at the heart of our democracies, and these people represent all that's good about that. So I'm going to ask them in just, 1 minute, what are the 3 or 4 words you would say to your peers? What would you say to governments? Geoff?
What I would say to it isn't my place to advise government, but I think the minister put it well.
But today it is.
Okay.
You've got the floor.
I know
Tell
you're the
governments
teacher.
what they need to do.
Well, I think government needs to keep stepping up. I mean, my view is that we see through the EITI in my sector, governments contributing, but we want them to be more granular. We want SOEs not to be free riders in the system. And we want, I think, donor governments to expect more of host governments wherever they can.
And when business says that to governments, I have to say even more strongly, when you say it with civil society to governments, then it has an impact. There's no doubt about that. So thank you, Geoff. To Minister Petrenko now, what do you want to say to civil society? Come on, you watch us every day. What do you want from civil society?
During these 4 years, civil society for us was real partners. So I want to say, NGOs and civil society, believe what you do, and it's more important, don't stop on the half of the way. And if you will do it, we'll be successful. Together with government, you have to control us, you have to help us, but nevertheless, don't stop on the half of the way.
We have to help governments. I think that's right. I think that's exactly our role. Sometimes it'll be an argument, but at the end of the day, I know as a trade union leader, we fight on the outside, but we settle the deal on the inside, and civil society needs to settle the question with governments about what makes for the future of good governance generally. Now, José, you get to tell international institutions, starting with, the World Bank, the IMF, the development agencies, anyone you choose, what do you want them to do? What's their role in this?
Basically, I would claim for trust. We are not the enemy. Civil society is not the enemy. We are fighting corruption because we are near the people and we understand what's going on there. Corruption is a tax that is paid by the poorest, but sometimes international institutions don't trust civil society organizations. We are not doing politics. We are not here in order to bring a second agenda. We are just trying to speak on behalf of the people. And I think that if institutional organizations would really trust civil society organizations too, we can do great partnerships, as we are doing with some institutions. Now we are speaking to the IMF. The World Bank has an anti-corruption agenda, but I still feel that there's a lack of trust on civil society organizations.
I don't think we could agree more. There's no doubt that our role is to be honest about the plight of people, but we are not the enemies of global governance. We want strong global governance with integrity in their heart. So thank you, José. And indeed, Mariam, you get the prize because you get to say to all leaders, all the people here, and that includes governments and business leaders and everyone else. From your position, what do you want everybody to do?
Well, I think perhaps there are 3 main things that I would like to say to all leaders. The first would definitely be connected development. So for development to be sustainable, it must be connected. What do I mean by connected? We need to realize the impact of every single dollar and every single cent that goes out the wrong way. the impact of corruption, the impact of illicit financial flows actually affects people's lives. It affects who lives. It affects people's maternal mortality. It affects who goes to school. So we need to keep that in our mind to keep our focus direct on what we must do. Secondly, I think collective ideas are important. You know, everybody has their individual ideas. Each of the stakeholders here have different ideas, but really bringing them together to implement them together, I think, is key. And finally, we must just go beyond the rhetoric. You know, we've spoken a lot about beneficial ownership. We've spoken a lot about open contracting. But what we need to do really now is to push the action, to see the action on ground making an impact.
I think you have it there. We need to share our prosperity, but we need to actually count every dollar. So that means every person counts. Beneficial ownership, open contracting, they're mechanisms, but at the heart of it, it's really about saying, what are we doing with our money and what impact does it have? Wise words, Mariam. Thank you very much. Now, what a panel. I want you to give them a big hand. And I'm going to ask them to stay here. There's been a fantastic lineup of wisdom here, and we haven't really had time to tap it, so I really apologise for that. But I thank you for your leadership. And to close us out on leadership, I want to introduce another B team leader. We're a bit of a club, aren't we? But Bob Collymore, where did you go? He was sitting down here, yes. And indeed, Bob Collymore, of course, as you know, is CEO of Safaricom Limited. But when you talk about courage, then this is a man that I've come to know for incredible courage. Just a couple of weeks ago in Kenya, in fact, I was waiting for an appointment with the UNEP director, and he was very late. And indeed, then I heard on the radio he was with Bob Collymore calling out a ban on plastics. It's the kind of man Bob is, but I can tell you he stood with all of us, with business CEOs on the question of LGBTI rights, and that takes courage. Amongst many, many other things, a bit of a wise kind of counsellor from time to time, prolifically read, Bob Collymore, welcome.
You know, when we think about what the world might look like in 2030, we hope that it'll be a fundamentally better place, one that'll be guided by the global goals, and one that will see us have a much more inclusive world. But one factor will not have changed, and that will be the truth that corruption will still be the biggest threat to growth, the silent cancer eating away at our communities and our economies. It's a catalyst to create unequal societies, going against the very spirit of the global goals. Corruption simply erodes trust. And for the first time, as many people said this morning, the Edelman Trust Barometer found that overall trust in businesses, in civil society, in governments has hit an all-time low. Combined, they're all less than 50%. We are quite simply, ladies and gentlemen, losing the fight against corruption. And that's why, as businesses, we need to seize the opportunity and to start to drive that change now. And this is why, as businesses, we have seen some positive outcomes that indicate that businesses can drive this agenda successfully. We believe that businesses makes the biggest difference when business leaders raise their voices and when companies show what is possible by leading by example. The progress that Robert highlighted today was enabled by this kind of leadership in business. And if we want to sustain and accelerate this progress, to create societies in which businesses and citizens can thrive because they're institutions that work, transparent markets and greater trust, then we need to do more for businesses to lead. Only a few years ago, creating more company ownership transparency was not really on the agenda. Working with civil society, business and investors have increasingly demonstrated their support and leadership. For example, Natura and Unilever proactively published more information about their own structures and ownership. Now, more companies have helped to create the open ownership, which will allow everyone to examine ownership across the globe over time and has started to disclose information on this platform. Business support helped to bolster the commitment and the ambition of governments. We've seen a significant increase in beneficial ownership transparency and new commitments by over 100 countries in the past 3 years. All of this indicates that business will continue to play a critical role by becoming more transparent, by encouraging their suppliers and partners to do the same, and by making clear to governments that creating more transparent markets is what they want and what they support. Business calls for government to reform their public procurement systems to make them more transparent, fair, and competitive have been growing. And over 40 countries have now made commitments to do this. In Kenya, we have supported the creation of the Africa Procurement Pool to create more competitive and transparent markets for African companies and SMEs to bid for tenders. Companies can make their own procurement much more transparent and competitive, including on platforms like OpenOps. In a time of declining trust in governments and business, making public procurement work means creating trust in both. As Geoff said this morning, tax is another area where business can build trust. Safaricom is the biggest corporate taxpayer in Kenya, and we've worked to bring all of our 800 suppliers into the tax base, as well as working with the tax authorities to use our digital payment platform, M-Pesa, to make payments of tax easier and free from the risk of bribery for citizens and small businesses. The B team is convening a company working group on responsible tax. 12 companies from 9 countries across extractives, consumer goods, industrial products, investments, and finance, as well as telecommunications, to create a new set of responsible tax principles and commitments. And we welcome more of you to join us in this work in 2018. As businesses, we can't thrive in environments where the rights of citizens and businesses to identify problems and to speak out is being repressed, as Sharan has said. In the past decade, over 100 countries have restricted civic rights, such as freedom of expression, assembly, and information. They're great examples of businesses who are playing a critical role in helping to defend these rights. Amongst the B team founding supporter, Tiffany and Company, who defended the rights of the journalist Rafael Marquez de Moray when he exposed corruption in the diamond industry in Angola and was threatened with 30 years imprisonment. The B team and many B team companies such as Virgin, Salesforce are involved in the business network on civic freedoms and human rights defenders, which we and our partners at Business and Human Rights Resource Center and the International Service for Human Rights invite you to join. In all of these efforts, we invite you to join us. Please contact the B team governance and transparency team at governance@bteam.org to get involved. And if we act collectively and consistently, our influence can be significant and enduring. Lastly, today we're pleased to be signing a memorandum of understanding with the Open Government Partnership, a partnership of over 70 countries funded by President Barack Obama to drive greater openness in government around the world. And when countries create their plans to become more open in company ownership, public procurement, money in politics, and other critical issues, business is frequently not at the table. Today, in this MOU, the B team and the Open Government Partnership commit to work together, starting in Ghana, Kenya, and Argentina, to involve business more in the development of national action plans. I'd like to invite the OGP President, Sanjay Pradhan, and President of OGP, just to make a few comments. Sanjay.
Thank you very much, Bob. This partnership between B Team and OGP is vital for this agenda of rebuilding trust in institutions. In a world that's beset with crises of trust, of closing civic space, and rising authoritarianism, the 75-country Open Government Partnership can be a powerful countervailing force to rebuild trust. A countervailing force of reformers in government, business and civil society that are collaborating and co-creating actions to open up government. And in this, the private sector is a vital partner and beneficiary. The business case is very clear. In South Korea, transparent e-procurement generated $6.6 billion in efficiencies. When Ukraine decided to disclose all contracts in open data standards, there was a 50% increase in the number of companies, including SMEs, bidding for contracts, building trust of business and citizens in government. Post-Panama Papers, OGP countries like UK, France, Kenya, and Nigeria are leveling the playing field by disclosing who really owns companies. And the McKinsey Institute estimates that open data can unlock $1.1 trillion per year in economic value. Now, for its part, the private sector can be a vital coalition partner to advocate for open government. For instance, the McCarthy Business Club, which partnered with government reformers to significantly improve the Philippines' ease of doing business ranking by 40%, generating a 66% increase in FDI and the country's first investment grade rating in 2014. This is the new social compact, trust and collaboration between government, businesses, and civil society that OGP can help deliver. It provides a vibrant global platform for which we invite private sector to engage in vigorously to rebuild trust. Today, we launch our flagship publication, Trust, The Fight to Win It Back, which is available on the Concordia app and on our website, and that a lot of the business leaders here, including Bob, Paul, Sharon, and others, have contributed. And this marks the promise of the B-Team OGP partnership. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sanjay. Ladies and gentlemen, by being here this morning, you have already demonstrated your interest and commitment to this. And we would really urge you to join us at the B-Team to continue to fight corruption and the scourge, which, as I said, if we don't fix it, the aims of the global goals will never be achieved because inequality and injustice will continue. So please contact the Transparency and Governance team at the B-Team, and please join us in this fight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. And Bob introduced a whole new challenge to us. It's lending a hand to SMEs. SMEs create massive amounts of jobs. They're tiny, they don't have the resources. Opening markets for that's impossible, but assisting their development and allowing them to operate in a transparent, anti-corrupt environment is essential. So Bob will add that to the agenda, and it's clearly critical. Indeed, Bob also said businesses can't thrive where rights are repressed, and I think that is part and parcel of what all the panellists and the speakers have said today. So give them a big hand. Now, the audience, not just here, but in our virtual audience environment as well, they've spoken and they've said that overwhelmingly they want business to create supply chain standards that promote sustainability and respect for human rights. Closely followed by being transparent about your company ownership, publishing information in open data format, and supporting governments to establish transparency in public procurement. There's an agenda. If we're all committed to that agenda, we can actually reach the goals that we've set out to achieve. And I want to actually bring you back to a couple of things. You need to watch for a Q&A session on Twitter, but most importantly, you need to take Paul's voice, his advice about voice your values, make no compromise, and from myself, support each other. Support each other. When you see someone acting out, encourage, don't be silent and think what a good act. Tell them. Tell the world. You have the tools now with social media, mainstream media. Speak up for each other. When business and civil society work together, that new social contract, we can do it. We can rebuild trust and indeed our democracies. I thank you very much. I'm sorry we had such limited time, But what a great morning, and what renewed commitment we have to fight corruption. Thanks, everybody.